and this meeting is being recorded so we can send it to subscribers later. But we do appreciate you guys coming. Like I said, we're just going to wait a couple minutes, let some stragglers come in. Our chat last week worked really well, where we had a lot of listener and reader feedback. So we welcome your questions and everything else. Obviously, this is an exciting time where we're talking Jazz basketball with the playoffs. Yeah, like I said, just a couple minutes. Eric, first of all, before we get really started, how's your day going?
It's been a busy day. It's been a long day.
Oh,
I feel like I've done a lot today. I did an extra story this morning about kind of how the schedule of the series was shaping out, how it's going to be really kind of bang bang with the game every other day as a result of Clippers Mavericks going the full 7. To start with that, Zoom with Boyan, Zoom with Donovan.
Clippers availability just ended.
What was that? Yeah, Clippers just did a Zoom with Ty Lue, the Clippers coach, which helped me finish writing my second story of the day. Yeah, it's been busy. It's been good.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and that's what's fun
and
about the
also
playoffs.
I did a radio interview with some fill-in co-host on.
As you can tell, I'm at the ESPN 700 studios right now, and yeah, just hosted the Spence Checkett show from 2 to 6 here, and then one of our esteemed guests was Eric, so that was kind of fun. Let's go ahead and get started because we are getting a bunch of people. We've already gotten 14 people so far, and I'm sure they'll continue to trickle in. But again, my name is Andy Larsen. This is Eric Walden. We are the Utah Jazz beat writers for the Salt Lake Tribune. We love doing these subscriber chats to show you guys the value of having a Tribune subscription and really kind of showing what we do in the most exciting time of the year, which is Jazz playoff season. If you haven't been to the one we did last week, this is our second one of these. So, we're still kind of maybe working out the kinks, but honestly, the first one went really well. So, we want to make you guys as involved as possible. So we want to answer your questions, your comments, your concerns about everything. There are a couple different ways you can do that. Last week, we just took your questions via chat, and you can see in Zoom, there's a chat thing at the bottom. If you hit chat and type in your questions, we will read those questions in the order they come in and answer them. So whatever Jazz topic you want to ask us about, we're happy to answer. This time, we're going to try something new and get everyone involved if they want to be on camera too. So if you want, the Zoom has a raise hand feature. It's down at the bottom where it says reactions. You can just raise your hand, and then we'll kind of call on you, basically unmute you, turn on your camera. I guess you'll have to turn on your camera yourself, but regardless, and then you can ask your question via voice and face and all of that, and we can kind of get to know our subscribers better too. So that's really exciting. And yeah, obviously that the Jazz are playing the Clippers tomorrow in this big second round matchup is fun as well. I mean, look, Karl Malone's in town to watch this game, right? Like Karl Malone, we saw him on the statue at Vivint Arena smoking a cigar, ready to go. I think that shows that it's kind of a big deal, don't you, Eric?
Yeah, it's pretty cool when a guy who has a statue of himself in front of the arena shows up to pose by the statue, dramatically smoke the cigar, and like proclaim, things are ready, things are happening. So yeah, I mean, I love the playoffs anyway. Like I've been watching NBA playoff basketball probably since before you've been alive, Andy. Even though you are an old man of 30 now, really getting up there, showing your age, getting a little decrepit.
Yeah.
But yeah, playoff basketball has always been fun just because, I know it's cliche to say, but there is like a different level of intensity to it. And it's not just, obviously this is something that the players will tell you, that they've got to take their games up a level once you reach the postseason. But it becomes apparent, for the fans too in the building, like everything takes on that much more added significance. And so there's, a little more pressure, each turnover takes on, a little more, ooh, what are the consequences of that going to be? Each offensive rebound allowed becomes that much more cringeworthy. Each open look at a basket, you start wondering, even if it's in the second quarter, like, is that going to be the one that they should have made that might wind up proving costly, in a close game in the fourth quarter? So I'm
Yeah,
excited.
stuff is important. No, and I completely agreed. And everything is so much of it can turn on luck. I mean, we saw that certainly last year with Game 7. When if Mike Conley makes a shot at the end, or the Jazz hit one more three, or quite frankly, if they just play worth a darn in the first half, like then they're in a good spot to win the series, and then instead you lose by one basket right in the end. So, yeah, I mean, it is like kind of heart wrenching in some ways. Again, I want to take your questions in the chat, on video, whatever it is. Again, raise your hand, or and if one of our Trib folks can watch for raised hands, that would also be really helpful too. But let's get into what we have prepared, Eric. We do have stuff prepared for this chat, and in particular, what kind of matchup difficulties the Clippers present for the Jazz, because I do think that there are real basketball X and O's worries for this Jazz team against the Clippers because of the way the Clippers play. In particular, the way that they've played against Dallas, where they're playing really small with Marcus Morris at center and switching everything, has presented problems for the Jazz in past playoff matchups with like the Houston Rockets and so forth. So, what do you see? How do you see that changing the series? And what I mean, to me, what are kind of the big things that the Jazz can do in order to attack that switching defense? That's something that both Bojan Bogdanovic and Donovan Mitchell talked about at Jazz practice today.
Yeah, and it's something that Ty Lue talked about at following the Clippers practice today as well. So as you mentioned, switching defenses have been something that have given the Jazz problems. Even in the beginning of this season, we saw them struggle against. Man, it was a bad team who I can't remember. Like maybe the Pistons. A Pistons team that turned out to be not very good, but early on in the season, their switching defense was enough to cause the Jazz some headaches, just because it wasn't something they had quite mastered yet. And so, as you mentioned, yeah, the Clippers went small for a lot of their 7-game series against Dallas. Part of this is because Serge Ibaka has been out with an injury. I think he missed something like the last 30 regular season games. Ty Lue didn't feel comfortable going to Ivica Zubac for heavy minutes. And frankly, what the Clippers did with Morris being able to shoot the ball was pretty effective. So what we're seeing from the Jazz is that, obviously this has been the book on them, right? Like just switch everybody and make them deal with that and prevent them from getting quite as many open looks. Well, we saw the Jazz start to deal with that in the final few games against the Grizzlies, where you saw, Rudy Gobert and Derek Favors start to come up higher in the paint defensively, right? So the Jazz's defense is designed to dissuade opponents from taking a bunch of threes and to deter people at the rim, and the inevitable, problem area that leaves is the mid-range. And we saw John Morant having a lot of success with that. We saw Dylan Brooks having a lot of success with that. And then the counter became, rather than having Rudy and Fave, hang out near the basket quite so much, come up a little higher on those pick and rolls rather than simply dropping back. And that really kind of, proved really effective. So obviously, the Clippers present an entirely different problem just because Kawhi Leonard is one of the best mid-range players in the entire NBA. So it'll be interesting to see, how this strategy works against them.
And in particular, like Kawhi Leonard makes mid-range shots like they're layups. He made 62% of his mid-range shots in this last series against the Dallas Mavericks. So like, if you can't allow Kawhi Leonard to just get open mid-range shots like you might be able to some other players and say, hey, look, even if you make 45% of them, we still feel like that's better offense than you taking threes. With Kawhi, he kind of does break the system almost like a Chris Paul, and so you have to change the system. Now, I think you're right. What they showed in the Memphis series and being able to push the bigs higher, prevent that mid-range shot, and make life tougher on John Morant is the kind of same approach that they'll have to take against Kawhi Leonard. But obviously, Kawhi Leonard is a better player than John Morant, is going to be able to get some of those shots off easier, and then be able to get to the rim also against that kind of defense in a way that, he just has more length and ability than Ja does to not get blocked by Rudy Gobert. So that's going to be a real key to the series for sure. I do want to shout out in our chat, David Bennett told me something I didn't know. The mailman Karl Malone, again, we talked about how he was at the Vivint Arena, statue of himself smoking a cigar. Also, John Stockton were both here for last night's Mark Eaton Memorial. So I didn't know that they were in town for that event. But obviously, for those two former longtime teammates of Mark Eaton to come to the memorial, and again, a big shout out to his family, and after that tragic death, I think says a lot about John Stockton. It says about Karl Malone, and I think it says a lot about what Mark Eaton meant to the Jazz's franchise after years of playing here. I also, Claudia points out that yes, we are taking your questions via chat, or you can raise your hand and we'll take them on video as well. But I think that there is still that tie to the past with John Stockton and Karl Malone coming into Utah, to honor their former teammate. And then it sounds like Karl Malone will be watching tomorrow's game as well. That's big time.
Yeah, for sure. And just going back to Mark Eaton, to your point, really, the news broke when I was in Memphis for games 3 and 4, and you and I immediately kind of go into scramble mode of reaching out to people who knew Mark, who played with Mark, who coached Mark. And the thing that stood out was just every single one of them talking about, obviously he played 11 years for the Jazz. He had a tremendous career here. He's hugely important to the history of the franchise. But what's even more, remarkable about him to all of them was just consistently, like, what a good person he was, right? Like, talking to Blue Edwards and talking about how, when he came in, when he was drafted, and he'd only ever seen Mark Eaton on TV, and then he meets the guy in person, and 7'4", that's a lot even for a basketball player, right? And he was like, man, what's this dude going to be like? Is he going to, he was intimidated. He said that he was intimidated. And then he's like, Mark became the guy who, like, he was the first guy to introduce himself to me. He was the first guy to kind of, take me under his wing. He taught me about, habits and kind of life of the NBA, and, like, hearing Mike Brown, the Brown Bear, talk about how, you I think there's a tendency for everyone to think that because guys are teammates, there's, an automatic friendship between them, and that's not always the case. And Brown Bear was talking about how, there was the potential there for it to be an awkward situation because these were two veteran players who were vying for minutes on the court. So, like, theoretically there was this competition between them, and how, Mike came into the situation feeling like, how am I going to get along with this guy? And Mark was just such a nice guy, invited him over to his house. He's like, hey, do you know how a wine cellar works? Let me teach you about, the temperature control on this thing. And just, story after story along those lines of just what a good dude Mark Eaton was. And I didn't get to know him super well. I had reached out to him a few times, hoping to do some stories, and we just never quite were able to connect. And that's one of my regrets to this day, that I never really got to have, an extended conversation with Mark. It became a thing where, like, back when we were allowed in the arena, and, the game ends and we're all the media is kind of huddled outside the locker room, waiting for access. And inevitably people would come out that tunnel, that filtered people into, the bowels of the arena there. And there were quite a few times where Mark would be there, just kind of hanging around, talking to people. And obviously 7'4", he gets noticed, but, just always, that's a guy where, he's in a position where that could get annoying really quick, having that kind of attention focused upon you. And maybe it was annoying, but from my vantage point, it seemed like, he always reacted to it well. He always treated people well when they came by, to wish him well or to say hello.
Yep, completely agreed. I actually want to talk David Bennett, who talked about, mentioned that John and Karl were at the memorial. He was at the memorial, and we've got him on. He's one of our Trib subscribers. We've got him on camera. So, David, do you mind sharing kind of what that was like as someone who was at Mark Eaton's memorial earlier?
Sure, Andy. And Eric, what you just said just could not be more true. I spent a lot of time with Mark. We went a lot of places, did a lot of things. Everybody comes up to him. Nobody ever left disappointed. Mark had time for everybody. He was always, regardless of the situation, always very compliant and wanting to have conversation with the fans, sign autographs, do pictures, whatever. Last night's memorial was just so classy. It was at Mark's restaurant. There's gardens adjacent to the restaurant. It was a private 200-person invite-only affair. A lot of teammates were there, including mailman. Stockton was the MC, believe it or not.
Really?
And really, he did a great job. Bobby Hansen was there. Mark Averoni was there. And people got up and spoke. A lot of family and friends spoke of remembrances of Mark. Of course, an evening like that would not be complete without the coach, Frank Layden, being there and doing about 20 minutes of stand-up with funny stories about Mark, including a quote that you had in the paper last week about when he first met Mark. So it was just a very nice evening. It was a perfect night. It was a great setting. And we are all very saddened by his leaving us way too soon.
Yeah. Still had a lot to give, but certainly gave a lot in his time here, and we always appreciate. He's a legend, and rightfully so. So, David, thank you for.
Andy, one last quick story. So
Yeah.
a few years ago, maybe 5 years ago, we were at one of Park City's parades, and we were leaving the parade, and Terry and I were walking behind Mark, and somebody comes up to Terry and goes, "Is Mark still playing basketball?" And she goes, "No, he retired years ago." And they said to her, "But he's still so tall."
That's certainly the case. Yes. I love that. Yeah. Anyway, thank you, David, for sharing that and sharing your experience with there at Tuscany. Or I presume it was Tuscany. Maybe it was Franks. Regardless, I think it's good we hit on that because obviously it was an important part of jazz history and some of the jazz you and I grew up with. I want to ask again, and if anyone else has any other questions they'd like to talk about this Jazz Clipper series, about the Jazz in general, about our jobs, about Mark Eaton, anything, whatever you want to ask, you can put it in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we'll call on you and turn your video on and all of that. I want to kind of transition back to the Jazz Clippers series, and we talk about their small lineups, right? The matchup problems that they might present. But I do think that the Jazz present matchup problems for the Clippers as well, because of how good of shooters they are. I think the Mavs got a lot of open shots that they hit in the first two games, and we were able to win the first two games. The Jazz will be able to consistently knock those down in a way that maybe Dorian Smith or Maxi Kleba weren't able to later on in the series, which ended up kind of changing things. Jazz with Mike Conley, I see your question, Randy Plant, about the latest on Mike Conley. We'll talk about that. But if Mike Conley's healthy, with Bojan Bogdanovic available, Joe Ingles, George Niang, Jordan Clarkson, you go down the list. Obviously, Donovan Mitchell, a terrific shooter as well. The Jazz have the ability to space the floor and make life pretty tough for these Clippers defenders.
Yeah, we saw the offensive production that they had against Memphis, where I think it was 5 guys on the team averaged 17 points per game, which is just, it's incredible. Like, when you consider where the game's come from its, low point in the 90s and early 2000s, where, 80 to 74 games were a little too semi-regular. This brand of basketball is pretty awesome by comparison. And to your point, more specifically about the Jazz, yeah, those 3-point threats are definitely a problem for the Clippers, because as you mentioned, it wasn't as though the Mavericks didn't get plenty of open looks in that series. It's just that their shooters are not as consistent. And so, you look at what the Jazz did this year, number 1 in NBA history in 3-pointers made per game over the course of the season. And not just the volume, but the efficiency. Obviously the Clippers finished number 1 in the league in 3-point efficiency, but the Jazz, I want to say, wound up third, somewhere right around there, third or fourth. And so taking that high volume of shots and being able to knock them down at that rate is certainly an advantage the Jazz have. If, obviously we'll have to see how the Clippers adjust, because we don't anticipate that they'll, bring out exactly the same defensive deployment against Utah that they did against Dallas. But if they do, that would be, that would be very much in the Jazz's favor. I thought Ty Lue said something that was interesting today on his availability. He basically said that, all the plays that he was going to call, all the plays that they normally run, went out the window after game 2. After that, he didn't say that it was like all improvisation from and all kind of, intuitive feel from him, the players, but it seems like there was quite a bit more, that once you got to game 2, kind of both teams knew what the other was trying to do. And so from there, it just became a matter of, okay, not scripting quite so much, not planning quite so much out. Obviously in certain, out of timeout situations or things like that, they'd run something specific, but more generally, it was just kind of guys reading and reacting. And this is something the Jazz have been excellent at over the course of the season, in terms of analyzing where the coverage is coming for and which, way to skip a pass in order to kind of generate an open look. So it's something they've been pretty masterful at. And I'm curious to see, what kind of looks they get against the Clippers, because this Clippers defense, its reputation is pretty excellent, and the reputation of some of the individual players, be it Kawhi, be it Paul George, be it Pat Beverly, is pretty outstanding. These guys are all super accomplished defenders over the course of their career, but I would argue that the Clippers defense on the whole this year did not quite live up to those standards. I don't know. What do you think, Andy?
Agreed, and it's been kind of inconsistent, right? Like we've seen games in which the Clippers defense has locked down, and I think we saw a pretty good example of that in Game 7, where they made life really difficult for Luka Doncic. I also think that, and heck, in Game 6 as well, I also think that there are times when they are just a complete nightmare and a mess. Like I actually thinking back to the early Mavericks Clippers match like back in December when the season first began, and we're talking about 150-160 point game that the Mavericks allowed, or the Clippers allowed the Mavericks to have. So I think that there are times where this Clippers defense can be exploitable. I think it is kind of like, this has always kind of been the question with the Clippers, is like, can they play as well as their talent shows? And I think the Jazz, as maybe the most cohesive team in the league, can take advantage of that lack of cohesion at time from the Clippers. They have a real true advantage of kind of chemistry and passing the ball and defending as a unit and all of that, in a way that I don't know that the Clippers are there yet. I do want to talk about Randy Plant's question on Mike Conley, because it does have it is a huge part of what the series will be. He just asked, what is the latest on Mike Conley? Latest we heard just about an hour ago was that he is officially listed as questionable for Game 1. So, kind of that 50-50 chance of whether or not he'll play is kind of what that means. Now, questionable is also kind of the status you might give if you knew for sure he wasn't playing, and you want the Clippers to think that he will, or even vice versa. You know for sure that he will play, and you want the Clippers to be kind of unsure about it. We can tell you that we requested him for media availability today, and we did not get to talk to Mike. We can tell you that he participated in portions of practice, but not all of practice earlier today. We'll see if he participates in shoot around tomorrow. That'll be tomorrow morning at about 10:30, 11. We'll find out that information. And then, I think obviously if he is able to play, there's also a question of, is there a minute restriction or anything like that? How impactful will Conley be able to be through this injury if he does play? So I think it's fair to be concerned about it if you're a Jazz fan. I think it's fair to, I think he has a big role to play in the series, and you never want to see this kind of hamstring injury happen, right now, especially when there are games every other day. And it's like, all right, well, if he's not ready for game 1, will he be ready for game 2 or 3 or 4? And you're just never really sure where that cascade would end.
Yeah. So the thing that we brought up this morning and with the schedule story was that on the one hand, yeah, awesome that the Jazz wrapped up their series in 5 games and the Clippers and Mavericks took 7 games. That gives the Jazz 5 whole days off between game 5 of the Memphis series and game 1 against the Clippers, whereas, the Clippers didn't finish up until Sunday. So theoretically, well-rested Jazz, tired Clippers, chance for Mike Conley to recover. But again, yeah, a little bit concerning that he only went through parts of practice today. Yeah, you would like once we found out that we weren't getting Mike, that indicated that he didn't go through the whole practice, which was something Jazz PR confirmed to us a little bit later. Because if a guy goes through a whole practice, they have to be made available to media if requested. So that was the tip off there, and yeah, that presents some issues. Ty Lue was asked, how does it change things in terms of the Clippers' preparation and trying to determine if Conley's going to play or not, which is a fair question. He said that, from his perspective, they have to anticipate that Mike will play because it doesn't do them any good to prepare as though he won't. That said, he obviously has seen plenty of games where Mike was out during the course of the season and the Jazz started Joe Ingles. So, he mentioned that they've got plenty of film there. They're well aware of what Joe can do. And from his perspective, he didn't feel like the Jazz fell off a whole lot during those times when they were starting Joe, when Mike was out. And there were a lot of good games where that happened, in fact. But, having that one extra piece, having a guy who's capable of sticking with smaller guards, who's capable of being yet another guy out there who can drain an open 3, would be a huge factor for the Jazz to have. Obviously, this Clippers team is really good, right? Like, they finished 4th in the West. Part of that is because they did a lot of load management for Kawhi during the year. Part of that is because Paul George missed some games. Part of that is, frankly, because they tanked their last 2 regular season games against the Thunder and the Rockets in order to wind up on this side of the bracket because they felt the matchups were better. Get them a first round matchup with the Mavericks, who they killed a year ago, and then beyond that with the Jazz. And I don't know if they thought the Jazz were an easier second round matchup than maybe the Suns or a lot of people thought the Lakers might have come out of that. Obviously, that didn't turn out to be the case, but Ty Lue said whether or not Mike Conley plays, he anticipates the Jazz are going to be a really dangerous team regardless. That said, I don't think anyone here feels entirely comfortable with how with the possibility of Mike not playing. Yeah, the flip side to the rest thing is that, yeah, once you do get into the series, because it did take those couple extra days to start, we went from, had Dallas won in game 6, there would have been a 3-day break between games 2 and 3 in this series. It would have been from game 1 would have been Sunday, game 2 tomorrow, and then game 3 wouldn't have been until this coming Saturday. So instead of having that big break in the middle of the series, it winds up getting moved in front of the series. And again, the benefit of that is that it winds up benefiting only the Jazz and not the Clippers, because the Clippers were still playing against Dallas. So we'll see. As Andy said, we'll find out early tomorrow kind of where Mike is at, whether he was a participant in shoot around, and from there we can kind of extrapolate the likelihood of him playing tomorrow night.
Agreed. And I will say real quick, with Conley, and if you don't have Conley, the nice thing about it is you move Joe Ingles into the starting lineup, who basically is kind of a starting caliber player, and you get Joe Ingles minutes guarding Paul George. And as you guys all know, watching the Jazz over the last 5 years, the Paul George and Joe Ingles matchup in 4 years ago with the Jazz playing the Thunder was some of the most entertaining basketball that we've seen, because we saw Joe and Paul go after each other. get in some little, some handbags and some kerfuffles, I guess you could even say. And it's a nice matchup for the Jazz to have Joe Ingles be able to guard Paul George. So again, we want to see Mike Conley out there. There's no question about it. But it's not, at least you do have Joe Ingles to kind of step up into that starting role and fill it a little bit and do some nice things. We got 2 questions in the chat I want to get to. Phil Weiss asks, do you ever tire of national pundits pontificating on the Jazz team and the franchise that they don't really know as well as you do? Do they ever reach out for you to you for perspective? First question first. Yeah, I get annoyed when people are wrong. I think you do too, Eric. Like when people are saying things that are not true. And I think this is especially true with Rudy Gobert, is that there are many national pundits who don't understand what Rudy Gobert is good at and what he is not good at, and completely kind of misunderstand what Rudy brings to the Jazz. And yes, Rudy is a terrific rim protector, but he's also a terrific screener. He's a terrific roller. He's actually quite good when defending out on the perimeter. He's good in defending isolation situations, better than people think. Now, is he a strange superstar? Is he the kind of player that usually gets 35% of the cap and $35 million a year? No, but in terms of what impact he has, I think when you and I watch this team day in and day out, we see how Rudy Gobert really changes things in a way that I don't think some national media people really understand because they just don't watch as much. Eric, do you agree?
Yeah. So in getting to the second part of the question, do people ever reach out to us? Andy and I both make quite a few radio appearances, whether they're, we do a lot, like Andy co-hosting The Drive with Spence Checketts. That's his name.
Yes,
I had a brain fart for a minute. Spence Checketts today on ESPN 700. But we also wind up getting, requests to appear on quite a few national shows, whether they're Sirius XM or, things like that. And the thing that, the number one question I got asked all season was, are Donovan and Rudy really okay? And then the second question was inevitably, explain Rudy Gobert to me. Why is he a thing? Why do Jazz fans love him? Why is he, and to your point, you alluded to this, the fact that we get to see him every day and we get to see the subtle little things he does, a lot of people on the East Coast are not getting a lot of Jazz games, like they'll get some highlights on ESPN and they'll see Rudy blocking a shot, or they'll see him, catching a lob from Mike and throwing it down. And that's their exposure to Rudy Gobert. And then beyond that, they're looking at box scores, or they're looking at, NBA.com leaderboard stat sheets or whatever. And, they're thinking, this is a guy who averages 14 or 15 points a game, and you're telling me that he's good on offense. Well, yeah, he dunks a lot, but what else? And so it becomes a thing where I have to tell them, watch something other than the highlight reels. Like, make it a point to watch a game and watch the screens he sets. I know that's not like anyone's ideal way to watch basketball, but I'm like, if you want to understand the Utah Jazz and Rudy Gobert's importance to this team, watch the screens he sets on offense to free guys up to get those shots, or to at least start the blender. So yeah, I feel like there are just a lot of people out there who don't put that particular effort in with this team. Mountain time zone team, too late.
Yeah, no,
just stay up and watch them on the back end of a TNT doubleheader or whatever. And I just feel like, a lot of them don't wind up catching the subtleties and the nuances of his game.
Agreed. Randy Plant in the chat asks, which Jazz non-starter needs to step up his game for the Jazz to win this series? And I think, to me, the answer is Jordan Clarkson. Because of how we think that the Clippers are going to be using the switching defense like they did against the Dallas Mavericks. If they kind of guard the Jazz in standard ways, I think then you can talk about Joe Ingles, or you could talk about Jordan Yang, or you can even Derek Favors. But if the Clippers are playing the switching defense, then I think you need people who can kind of attack and take advantage of those mismatches. And when I think of guys who can take advantage of mismatches, I'm thinking of Jordan Clarkson because of his way that he can get around bigger guys like a Marcus Morris or a Serge Ibaka, make them kind of regret having a bigger guy on them, draw those fouls at the 3-point line, kind of all the Jordan Clarkson tips and tricks on how to score 20 points a game. He can use those when it's not a ideal guy matched up against him. So I think, to me, I want to see better from Jordan Clarkson. I want to see smart play. And it is a fine line there of like attacking and being able to score while not necessarily giving the ball up in terms of turnovers and taking smart shots and that kind of thing. You know, we saw the best of Jordan Clarkson at the beginning of the season. The Jordan Clarkson we saw against Memphis was not great. You know, he shot 40% from the floor, 23% from three, had 3 turnovers a game. If we can get a solid Jordan Clarkson, I think that will help the Jazz a lot. Eric, would you agree, or do you have another non-starter you want to focus on?
Yeah, JC was my first choice just because the volume of shots that he takes, the volume, the amount of time he has the ball in his hands. You'd like to see the decision making a little bit better than it was against the Grizzlies. You'd like to see the efficiency go up a little bit more than it was against the Grizzlies. I mean, the obvious second choice is has a little bit of an asterisk to it because will Joe Ingles be starting in this series with Mike potentially out? But I don't anticipate Joe's going to struggle as much against the Clippers as he did against the Grizzlies, for the simple fact that I don't anticipate them guarding him the same way. And Andy, you can weigh in there on what the likelihood you think is of seeing some of those same tricks that Memphis employed to kind of limit Joe's involvement to a degree we haven't really seen. But
I mean, look, I don't think that they used any special mind voodoo tricks. I know Joe said, so we asked Joe, like, look, dude, why are you scoring 6 points a game here? I mean, we said it in a nicer way, and we asked it in a serious basketball
exactly like
way.
that.
But he averaged 6 points a game in the Memphis series, and the Jazz are at their best when Joe Ingles is knocking down threes and is part of pick and roll and all of the good Joe Ingles stuff. And he said, essentially, well, Kyle Anderson is sticking to me and I want to keep him out of the action so that the other guys can score. And I think that makes sense. I agree with that. I think we saw some of the benefits of that when Mike Conley and Donovan Mitchell had such successful series. And, obviously the Jazz won. And yet I also want Joe Ingles. I saw Joe Ingles pass up shots. I saw Joe Ingles pass up opportunities to run pick and roll. And I want to see him be more aggressive, more involved in the offense when he does have the chance to be. So there was no like special voodoo that the Grizzlies were doing to guard Joe Ingles. I do think Joe Ingles needs to be a little bit more aggressive in this series offensively, and I think he'll have the chance to be.
I think it's a funner story if there was voodoo being used. We need to pursue that line of questioning.
I suspect that there was not. I got another question from Fred Larsen. I would, no relation, just kidding. That's my dad. But I appreciate that my dad is joining us in the chat today and, is a Tribune subscriber and therefore can be involved. I think even if he didn't subscribe, I guess we would probably let him in the chat, just because contributions to the paper in general by, feeding me for the first 20 years of my life or whatever.
Subscribers only chat, Andy. We don't break the
rules. No exceptions.
No.
Luckily, he does subscribe, and it's only to read Eric Walden's content. But he asks, I'm guessing Royce O'Neal will be tasked with guarding Kawhi Leonard. How do you see that matchup? And I think it's a really interesting question. I do think that it's most likely Royce starts guarding Kawhi, and I think it is a kind of matchup that actually that Royce is better at defending than he is at sometimes defending the guards of the league. And if you go back to January, I wrote a story about how Royce O'Neal's defense really does differ depend on who he's guarding. So you look at his numbers from last season. When he was guarding guards, those guards were actually extremely effective. They scored 20 points a game. They were shooting efficient numbers from field goal range, from three. They were getting assists. They were able to find their spots and take good looks. When Royce O'Neal was guarding bigger wings, the Kawhi Leonards, the LeBron James, the Paul Georges, these 6'7", 6'8", 6'9" guys that proliferate throughout the league, Royce did a lot better. Royce is kind of able to be physical with them. They can't take advantage of their quickness as much, and Royce can kind of bother their looks a little bit. So the efficiency numbers were much lower when Royce guards a bigger guy, even though Royce is not that tall himself. He's only 6'4". So I think Kawhi is actually a relatively good matchup for Royce. And yet, because Kawhi Leonard is Kawhi Leonard, a player who really won a title with the Toronto Raptors as the lead guy, as a guy who just took over in big situations and big games, it would not shock me at all to see Kawhi Leonard cook Royce, because he cooks really nearly every defender in the NBA. So I think it's a really interesting matchup. I think it's definitely one to watch. And if Royce can keep Kawhi maybe in check a little bit, I'm thinking in actually, this was a series that the Raptors won, but the Raptors Sixers series, Kawhi took a lot of shots. He took 30 to 35 shots a game. And yes, he scored 35 to 40 points a game, but I think it gave the Sixers defense on Kawhi, gave them a chance in that series. And if the Jazz can kind of keep him to taking a lot of shots and missing, 50 to 60% of them, that will mean that they can play normal defense on the other guys and not give up the 3-point open shots that can really kill you.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, first of all, something you brought up late in that is just fascinating to me, which is that Royce is 6'4", but is so much more effective at guarding the bigger, longer, stronger guys than he is the smaller, quicker ones. As for Kawhi, yeah, I mean, you look at those last two games of the Dallas series, and he shot roughly about 75% from the field in those two games combined. So just the Mavericks did not do nearly enough to make it hard on him. And where I think the Jazz have an advantage there, and Andy, you've brought this up, is that, as the Jazz are playing their scheme, and they have to adjust to, guarding those mid-range opportunities, Rudy's a lot more mobile than Boban Marjanovic is. So
Yes.
That's going to help. To your point, I don't think any one person, and as good as Royce has been, as all NBA, all defensive team candidate this year, has spent, the first or second most minutes of anyone in the league on the opposing team's top scoring option. He's not capable of shutting down Kawhi Leonard by himself. It literally is dependent on the scheme. It literally is, to Boyan's point, post-practice today, we need to keep him in front of us. We need to make him work. We need to make sure that the level of shots he's getting are a little bit tougher than what he got against Dallas. And that's the best you can hope for in slowing him down. And then from there, it becomes, honestly, what we saw from the Clippers in game, obviously Kawhi was transcendent in game 6 against Dallas, right? 45 points, tying his career playoff high. He was efficient in game 7, but he wasn't otherworldly. What we saw really do the Mavericks in was their inability to stop anyone else from hitting three-pointers. Like
Right.
The Clippers, as we mentioned before, an extremely efficient three-point shooting team, best in the league this year. And they were right about 50% in that last game because they're getting one open look after another. And then all of a sudden you've got Luke Kennard burying you, and you've got Reggie Jackson burying you, and you've got Nick Batum burying you. So honestly, part of, the Jazz's ultimate defensive success is not merely, slowing down Kawhi, but, he had 9 or 10 assists in that game 7. So it's limiting the looks of the other guys too.
Agreed. You just can't give up both, right? Like you can't let him be a scorer and an assister. Like that's what kills you. I mean, to some extent, like I said, Kawhi made 62% of his mid-range shots. That's amazing. And the Jazz need to have Rudy Gobert high on the pick and roll to make that not work. But they also can't let Marcus Morris shoot 48% from 3. They can't let Pat Bev shoot 40% from 3, because that's just as efficient as a 62% mid-range shot. The whole 3 is more than 2 thing is real, and the Jazz, and obviously Quinn Snyder knows this, and they'll work to prevent it. So we do usually try to keep these to about 45 minutes. That's what we're going for. We do have one more question from Bart Barker, and then I want to get to a wrap up, just kind of a series preview. But Bart asks, how did the Jazz get where most players and Quinn say obviously a dozen times in an interview? And I'll tell you what, talking is hard. I just talked on a radio show for 4 hours and stumbled over my words, and I'm sure I said or obviously or some word a gazillion times more than I should have. And so obviously it is difficult to talk, and obviously I'm sorry for that. And I will defend Quinn and defend the Jazz players in that. It's funny how different players have their different like go-to stutter words. Some players use some players say like in the end or moving forward. They just whatever their pause word is to let them think. Obviously is kind of Quinn's.
Yeah, is the one that I wind up taking out of my transcription program the most frequently. The only one who I would say I've noticed fixating on the word obviously a lot is Joe. And next time you listen to a Joe interview, you'll notice that he drops obviously in there, and sometimes in random places too, where it's like you didn't really need to
that doesn't make a lot of sense.
But yeah, to your point, everyone's got their little fallback phrases.
Everyone's got a verbal tick for sure.
Yeah, Donovan likes to drop in at the end of the day quite a bit. I'm sure. Yeah, to your point, yeah, like I'm much more comfortable being on the other end of those. Asking a question that lasts 15 seconds as opposed to speaking for 45 minutes.
At least 15 seconds, Eric. That's an understatement. You ask questions sometimes that last 45 seconds, a minute long.
I've been exposed to Quinn too long. I get a little convoluted in my setup, and yes, I see. To Andy's point, talking is hard. That's a good point, though. I do need to get a little more concise in my question asking, and I will take that to heart. Obviously, at the end of the day, being an interviewer.
Don't start, Eric. It's going to be one of those things where you're using it to make fun of yourself, and then you ironically say it, and then you're going to really start doing it, and it's going to be a problem. Let's wrap up the series preview real quick. Just kind of overall, my thought is that this is a close series. What's your prediction first, and then I'll give mine.
Ooh, that's a tough one. I want to be all Tony Jones-like and say that the team that scores more points will win, but I won't do that. I think the Jazz will win. I think they will win in a tough Game 7 at Vivint Arena on June 20th.
I like it. No, I agree. I think it's very, very close. The Las Vegas odds makers have the Jazz as slight favorites. You have to bet $130 in order to win $100 back to give you an idea of kind of what the Jazz, what they think. And I think it's going to be really interesting. I think the first couple of games are going to reveal a lot about how the series will unfold. Ultimately, I might take the Clippers. Is that crazy? I know I may not get any more subscriptions ever again by saying that, but I do just think that the Clippers set up in a really tough way for the Jazz. And then I worry about Mike Conley's injury playing a really big role in this series. If he's not able to play in the first couple of games, that really could swing things in a big way. So that's my thought, is Clippers in 7. I get you said Jazz in 7, but again, this series is so close and could make either of us look very dumb. But that's what's fun about saying different things, is at least one of us was right?
Yeah, at least one of us will come off looking very intelligent to our loyal subscribers who are looking for gambling advice. Probably it's the sole reason that they join this thing, right?
I'm sure. Yeah.
Put my money on. No, to your point, like the Clippers are an incredible team, right? Like when the season started, they were definitely one of the favorites to win the championship among all the pundits' picks. I feel like that fell off a little as the season went along because of their injury issues, because of their load management issues, because they finished 4th in the West. But now that we've seen playoff Kawhi, that guy, unlike Jimmy Butler, is actually stupidly locked in, and he's an incredible elite player. He's going to give the Jazz a lot of problems. The rest of their guys are capable of giving the Jazz a lot of problems. No result in this series would shock me. Like it could be a sweep in which, one
That
team
wouldn't shock you.
wins each game by, 2 points. I mean,
Yeah,
I
I mean,
I don't see it going that way, but it's not outside the realm of possibilities in my head. So
all right. Well, there's our predictions. We'll see what happens. Obviously, there's so much we just don't know in terms of availability and whatever else. But I love the Jazz with all my heart, and yet, I think this is a tough matchup, and so I'm really interested to see how this unfolds. But
I
I
maintain more professional objectivity, and I'm still
yeah,
the
yeah,
one
yeah,
picking
yeah.
them. So
You're a Lakers fan. You don't get to say anything. All right. Well, let's go ahead and wrap this up. Before we do, I want to thank you guys so much for being subscribers and ask you to tell your friends about this deal that we have. We currently have 52. It's $52 a year to get the kind of basic subscription entry for the Tribune. So if you've got anyone in your life who had wanted to sign up for the Trib, but it's been too expensive in the past, we're letting people have online access, the basic online access for $52 a year. So let them know. Thank you guys already for subscribing and always, supporting us by being in this chat, for example. I've also seen emails and comments from a lot of you in the past, so I really appreciate that. We're going to be doing one of these as frequently as we can, as travel allows. I'm going to be going to LA for games 3 and 4 to cover the series in person. So I'm excited for that as well. We'll continue to keep you as updated as humanly possible on this Jazz series, with not only daily updates, but then some really cool enterprise features that we're working on to kind of give you the inside sight and what's going on with the Utah Jazz. So again, thank you all so much for subscribing, for listening, for supporting. But for now, Andy Larsen, Eric Walden signing out. Have a good night,
thank you,
everyone.
everyone. Have a good night.